The silence did not arrive suddenly. It crept in after the music faded, after the crowds dissolved, after the world decided it had heard enough. At 81, Diana Ross stands not at the center of a spotlight, but at the edge of memory, where grief is quieter, heavier, and far more unforgiving. Michael Jackson's voice once echoed beside hers, a shared history woven through sound, ambition, and survival. Then, without warning, that voice vanished, leaving behind questions no tribute could answer. This is not a story about scandal or spectacle. It is about absence, about what remains when a bond formed in youth is severed by time, judgment, and death. Diana Ross carried the weight of being both witness and symbol, expected to speak, to explain, to resolve what the world could not understand. Instead, she chose restraint, silence, distance that looked cold to outsiders, but felt necessary to survive. What does it cost to love someone the world refuses to forgive? What happens when loyalty becomes a burden and memory itself becomes dangerous? This is the quiet reckoning of a woman who outlived the noise and must now face what the silence has preserved and what it has destroyed. The room is quiet in a way only earned after decades of noise. Not peaceful, intentional. Diana Ross sits within carefully controlled stillness, where the walls hold memories but offer no commentary. Evening light drifts across polished surfaces, soft and fading, like an audience long since dismissed. The applause that once followed her everywhere has receded into a distant echo, replaced by something heavier, the responsibility of what remains unsaid. After Michael Jackson's death, the world leaned forward all at once. Cameras waited. Questions multiplied. Silence became suspicious. There was an expectation that she, of all people, would speak with authority, with intimacy, with finality. She was positioned as witness, mentor, symbol, and judge all at once. But inside her private spaces, the decision was not framed as courage versus fear. It was survival versus exposure. The silence she chose was not absence, it was containment. Every word carried the potential to fracture memory, to be reshaped by agendas she could not control. She understood the machinery of public narrative too well. She had lived long enough to know that truth, once released, no longer belonged to its originator. In withholding her voice, she attempted to protect something fragile, perhaps Michael's humanity, perhaps her own. At night, the quiet grew louder. The absence of sound amplified what memory refused to soften. Missed calls replayed not as events, but as sensations, hesitation, exhaustion, restraint. There were words she composed mentally and then dismantled before dawn. Not because they were false, but because they were too complete. Public tributes were issued, carefully worded and widely scrutinized, yet they felt insufficient even to her. They honored the icon while leaving the person untouched. Psychologically, she existed in tension between eras. The young girl who learned discipline at Motown still lived inside her. The one taught that control was protection, that visibility was dangerous. That girl understood silence as strategy, but age complicated that instinct. As time passed, restraint began to feel less like protection and more like erasure. The world interpreted distance as judgment. Neutrality became narrative. Silence, once chosen, began to speak on her behalf. In reflective moments, she returned to shared beginnings. The raw ambition, the mutual understanding formed before fame distorted intention. Those memories remained intact only because they were not spoken aloud. Yet the cost of preservation was isolation. Each passing year narrowed the window in which explanation felt possible. The longer she waited, the heavier the silence became. The public never stopped asking, but the questions grew colder, less curious, more accusatory. And still, she remained composed. The discipline that built her career now governed her grief. But discipline has limits. Even legends feel the weight of unfinished truth pressing inward. As night settles again, the room offers no answers, only echoes. The unresolved question lingers in the quiet. Did silence protect what mattered most? Or did it quietly allow something irreplaceable to disappear forever? The past opens not with glamour, but with pressure. Long before the world learned their names, rehearsal rooms hummed with adult urgency, fluorescent lights buzzing above children asked to perform certainty they did not yet possess. Diana Ross was still learning the shape of her own voice when discipline arrived first, praise second. Michael Jackson learned even earlier that childhood was negotiable, something to be postponed in exchange for excellence. In those rooms, innocence was not lost suddenly. It was edited out, moment by moment. Adult voices counted beats, corrected posture, demanded repetition. Mistakes were not tolerated, only refined. Emotionally, Ross recognized something familiar in the young boy beside her. A sensitivity sharpened by expectation, a desire to please that ran deeper than ambition. He did not need to say it. She could see it in the way he listened too closely, smiled too carefully. Psychologically, identity formed under constant observation. Approval became currency. Love was measured in applause, safety in obedience. Performance replaced selfhood so completely that silence felt safer than protest. Their connection existed in this quiet space, not as friendship in the ordinary sense, but as mutual recognition. Two children understanding that survival depended on restraint. There were moments when the cost surfaced briefly, in fleeting exhaustion, in eyes that searched for permission to rest. But rest was interpreted as weakness, and vulnerability as delay. Each correction, each rehearsal, trained them to suppress instinct and elevate endurance. What they learned was not only how to perform, but how to endure being watched without breaking. Success arrived early and loudly. Stages grew larger while their inner worlds remained unfinished. Fame promised protection but delivered exposure. Every triumph widened the gap between who they were and who they were required to be. Ross learned adaptation, how to contain vulnerability without extinguishing it. Jackson, younger and more fragile, absorbed the lesson differently. The armor formed quickly, brilliant and reflective, hiding what could not be defended openly. Key moments passed without ceremony. The first time applause felt necessary rather than joyful. The first realization that stopping was not an option. Trust became selective. Adults were managers before guardians. Childhood became a resource to be spent wisely, not a state to be preserved. Foreshadowing settles quietly here. The same ambition that propelled them forward also narrowed their emotional escape routes. What bonded them, shared pressure, shared silence, would later complicate loyalty when the world demanded clarity and judgment. The answer waits, deferred by time, discipline, and the unrelenting gaze of success itself forever. The chapter closes suspended in that early stillness, where expectation drowned instinct. When childhood is consumed by ambition, and love is conditional on performance, the question lingers unanswered. Where does loyalty learn to live? Fame does not arrive as a single moment. It accumulates. With each tour, each headline, each expectation layered upon the last, it reshapes those inside it. For Diana Ross, ascent brought clarity. She learned the architecture of control, how to manage distance, how to protect the interior by refining the exterior. Composure became a skill sharpened over years of scrutiny. Image was not vanity, it was insulation. Michael Jackson's ascent followed a different trajectory. The stages grew larger, the crowds louder, yet his inner world narrowed. Fame amplified what was already fragile, turning sensitivity into isolation. Where Ross built boundaries, Jackson retreated inward. Guarded estates replaced rehearsal rooms. Security replaced companionship. The world became something to manage rather than inhabit. Emotionally, Ross watched with admiration threaded by unease. His brilliance was undeniable, yet it arrived alongside patterns that alarmed her, a withdrawal that deepened over time, eccentricities framed by the public as spectacle rather than signal. She recognized the cost of constant exposure because she had paid it herself. But recognition did not grant access. Concern, when expressed, was often deflected, interpreted as misunderstanding or misplaced loyalty. Psychologically, the distance between them widened not from conflict, but from strategy. Ross understood that survival at that altitude required precision. Association carried consequences. Every public alignment risked misinterpretation. Silence became not indifference, but calculation. She measured her words carefully, sometimes choosing absence over explanation. The world interpreted this restraint as detachment, unaware of the vigilance beneath it. Key moments passed without headlines but left lasting impressions. Conversations cut short, invitations declined, public appearances avoided. Jackson's isolation intensified as judgment hardened around him. What the public labeled as oddity masked a deeper retreat, one fueled by mistrust and fatigue. Ross saw the danger, but also saw the limits of intervention. Protection, when offered publicly, could become another form of exposure. Foreshadowing darkens as scrutiny intensifies. The space to defend nuance shrinks. Private truths become impossible to articulate without distortion. Ross's instinct to protect collided with her instinct to endure. Each step back felt necessary, yet each absence carried consequence. The fracture does not arrive with confrontation. It forms quietly, through distance and timing and the slow erosion of access. From the outside, restraint begins to resemble abandonment. From within, it feels like the only way to survive. The chapter closes on this unresolved divide, where silence stands between intention and perception, and the line between protection and disappearance grows dangerously thin. The shift was not subtle. It arrived like weather, sudden, violent, and inescapable. Headlines replaced harmony. Allegations crowded out history. The public imagination, once captivated by brilliance, began to harden into suspicion. Michael Jackson's identity was no longer shaped by music, but by accusation. The world did not pause to breathe. It accelerated, feeding on certainty before truth had time to surface. The setting fractured into noise. Televised outrage flickered endlessly. Courtrooms became theaters. Commentary replaced context. Every image was dissected, every silence interpreted. In this chaos, nuance had no shelter. The narrative demanded sides, and hesitation was translated as complicity. The world turned, and it did so loudly. Diana Ross responded not with declarations, but with withdrawal. Her absence was precise, measured, and deeply misunderstood. Emotionally, the conflict tore inward. Loyalty pulled one direction, survival another. To speak publicly was to tether her legacy to a storm that promised no resolution. To remain silent was to accept judgment by omission. Neither option preserved truth. Both carried consequence. Psychologically, fear did not manifest as panic. It arrived as calculation. Ross had spent a lifetime constructing durability in an industry that devoured vulnerability. She understood how quickly association could become erasure. The same public that once elevated could dismantle without warning. Silence, in this moment, became armor. Not moral certainty, not condemnation, self-preservation. Meanwhile, Jackson's world narrowed further. The isolation that had once been gradual became absolute. Trust evaporated. Spaces emptied. Familiar voices grew distant. The scrutiny intensified his retreat, pushing him deeper into guarded solitude. What little connection remained became fragile, strained by legal strategy, public pressure, and the impossibility of normal contact. Key moments unfolded away from cameras, but left indelible marks. Attempts at communication stalled. Words felt dangerous. Timing never felt right. Ross's distance solidified not through rejection, but through inertia, the paralysis that forms when every choice promises harm. Each unspoken word increased the weight of the next. Foreshadowing sharpens here. Time becomes adversarial. Opportunities for reconciliation shrink as narratives calcify. The world demands final positions while private truth remains complex, unresolved. Ross senses the closing of a window she does not know how to reopen. Silence, once strategic, begins to feel irreversible. The emotional cost accumulates quietly. Guilt does not announce itself. It settles. Loyalty, left unexpressed, mutates into regret. Yet still, restraint holds. The machinery of public judgment offers no safe exit. To intervene now would not restore balance. It would invite destruction. As years pass, the noise does not diminish. It hardens into record, into assumption, into cultural memory. Jackson remains surrounded yet unreachable, present everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Ross remains composed, but composition cannot stop time. The chapter moves toward inevitability. Loss approaches without ceremony, without reconciliation, without the closure both history and humanity crave. The finality looms, not just of life, but of unanswered connection. It ends suspended in dread and distance, with the knowledge that some separations do not announce themselves as endings. They simply persist until there is no time left to undo them. Time alters the scale of everything. What once felt urgent now feels distant, and what once felt distant now returns with quiet precision. In the present, Diana Ross exists beyond the fever of relevance, in a space where fame no longer demands defense. Awards sit motionless, symbols of moments already completed. They do not speak. Memory does. The setting is restrained, soft light, controlled quiet, a life arranged with intention. Aging has stripped away performance, leaving only reflection. Emotionally, this is not a chapter of confession, but of reckoning. Ross does not revisit the past to assign blame. She studies it to understand consequence. Silence, she knows now, is not neutral. It preserves some truths even as it buries others. Psychologically, legacy reveals itself as heavier than triumph. Influence lingers without instruction, shaped as much by absence as by presence. Ross recognizes that she did not need to speak to shape perception. Silence itself became narrative, interpreted, debated, fossilized. The world filled the gaps she left behind, often incorrectly, but permanently. There is acceptance here, not relief, but clarity. Defense is no longer required. The fear that once governed restraint has softened into understanding. She sees now that survival came at a cost, and that cost cannot be reclaimed or rewritten. What was protected remained intact only within her. What was withheld became unreachable to everyone else. Michael Jackson exists now as memory filtered through noise, celebrated, condemned, misunderstood, immortalized. Ross carries a version untouched by headlines, preserved by proximity and time. That truth survives only because it was never released. Yet it also remains isolated, unable to counterbalance the narratives that hardened in its absence. Emotion settles into something quieter than regret. It is acknowledgement that some choices cannot be evaluated solely by intention. That restraint can both shield and silence. That dignity and loss sometimes share the same shape. Ross understands that the silence she chose did not end with her. It traveled forward, shaping interpretation long after the moment had passed. The final realization arrives without drama. History does not ask permission before moving on. It absorbs what is given and invents the rest. Silence, once chosen, becomes permanent architecture within the story itself. The chapter closes in stillness, not resolution. Ross remains, carrying truths that no longer require validation. The noise has faded. What remains is quieter, heavier, and enduring. The understanding that some stories are shaped not by what is said, but by what